So, before we begin the official grand rounds, I want to acknowledge our partners at Aetna for sponsoring this event. We are so grateful for their support, which makes these learning opportunities possible. And I'm going to pass it to Leanne so that she can give a few remarks, who represents Aetna today.
Good morning, everyone. Leanne Maugry, and I'm the Executive Director of Supporting Kentucky Youth, the SKY program with Aetna Better Health of Kentucky, and we are part of the CVS Health family. And we're so excited to always partner with Kentucky Youth Advocates as well as our Bounce Coalition here to ensure that these learning opportunities and ground rounds are offered and available to everyone. We're especially excited to support today's topic on supporting students in the classroom with trauma-informed strategies to address challenging behaviors. This discussion is so very important for us to have, and we really want this focused discussion with all of you as experts to help us identify best practices and ways to support our the ability for us to serve our Kentucky youth. So I'm looking forward to the time that we spend together this morning, looking forward to the information that is shared and the learning opportunities that we all have together. So let's have a good time during this grand rounds this morning and enjoy the information we learned.
Thank you so much, Leanne. We appreciate your partnership. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Bounce. So Bounce is an organization that focuses on resiliency in children, adults, and families by improving knowledge about the impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We provide education and training. We provide evaluation services to measure the impact of healing center practices, and we advocate for policies that support people who have experienced trauma and help prevent trauma and build resiliency. So this is a slide that talks a little bit about statistics and information about ACEs. ACEs are common, that more than 22% of Kentucky kids have experienced at least two ACEs. And at the time of this study, that was the eighth highest rate in the country. So we are at the eighth highest rate in the country. We know that ACEs have long life effects on health and overall success and well-being. And because we've seen this study was done very early on, probably about 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. I'm just throwing that out there. I need to look that up and get that information. And then I'll put that in the chat. And so we've seen this longitudinal study of the effects of ACEs. But there are steps we can take to reduce the impact of ACEs so that Kentuckians grow up healthy and hopeful. And just like this Bounce Grand Rounds, we want to get information out to help our students and our families in support of ACEs, the work of ACEs. I would love to introduce Dr. Leah Riggs. She is going to be our speaker today. So the focus of today's webinar is on keeping students in the classroom, trauma-informed practices for behavior management. This session will explore the impact of trauma on student behavior and equip participants with trauma-informed strategies and tools to address challenging classroom behavior to keep students engaged in learning environments. So with us today is Dr. Leah Riggs. Leah is a training specialist for the Center on Trauma in Children. She received her master's degree in rank 1 in education from the University of Kentucky and has served students, teachers, and families impacted by trauma for over 15 years. She has worked closely with the CTAC, the Kentucky Department of Education, and the National Association for School Mental Health to bring trauma-informed care to classrooms across the Commonwealth. Leah received her PhD in curriculum and instruction with a special education emphasis, focusing her research on identifying, implementing, and evaluating evidence-based practices for supporting students exposed to trauma. Please join me in welcoming Leah.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I want to put this screen back up really quickly just so that you can get my email if you need it. We're going to talk through a lot of strategies today, and I'm always happy to meet up with folks and answer questions. So if you have things that come up that you're like, hey, I'd really like to try that in my school or in my district, please feel free to reach out. We love to hear from you. Just going to give you a little information about our center if you're not familiar with us. We are the Center on Trauma in Children. We are a part of the University of Kentucky, housed in the College of Medicine. We do a lot of different things, as you can see here, a lot of treatment, a lot of evaluation, assessment for children and families. I do want to draw your attention to a couple of our clinics down on the bottom. You can see there our CATS clinic is where we accept referrals from DCBS workers, and then we provide assessment and treatment for children and families who have open DCBS cases. But our Caddy clinic, and one of my colleagues is going to drop a link in the chat for you for our Caddy Clinic. That is where we provide free services for children and youth, including trauma-informed evidence-based treatments, and anyone working with children can make a referral. So if you are in a school setting or a clinical practice or social work or however it is that you interact with children, if you ever felt the need, you could make a referral to our Caddy Clinic. And again, those services we provide for free. So I'm so happy that you're here with us. We're going to talk about keeping kids in the classroom. A lot of what we're going to do today is based in practice. So I think my bio says 15 years in education. I think it's closer to 20 at this point, but I have spent a lot of time with some of our most challenging students, those with the highest needs in schools and districts, and really working not just with the kiddos themselves, but also staff. And how do we support our teachers and our staff, but how do we support our students? So we're going to talk through some real world, real life examples of how we can come together and support our kiddos. I do want to take just a second to remind us to take care of ourselves. We are talking about things that can be unpleasant, and we never know what that might bring up within us or within someone else in this virtual room. So I want you to feel empowered to take a break if you need to. If we are talking through this and you need to turn your camera off and step away, please feel free to do that. If later on today you're thinking about things, make sure that you are thinking about ways to support yourself. So talk to someone, do something relaxing, right? Make sure that you prioritize your own well-being, and take care of yourself. We can't help others if we don't help ourselves first. So I want to make sure that we do that. These are our objectives for today. We're going to talk very briefly, just a little bit of background information on trauma, how it impacts our students. I do present this from sort of the school lens, so I will talk a lot about classrooms and teachers and support staff, but the practices that we will look at are appropriate whatever your setting is. So if you are a clinician, if you work with students in a small group, large group, one-on-one, however it is that you interact with kiddos, these strategies will apply. So you'll hear me say classroom, but that is, it transcends the setting. We're going to look at a case study to examine really what these behaviors look like, how they manifest in the classroom, and then how we can support students with these types of experiences. And really then the bulk of our time together will be spent on what are those strategies that we can use that help keep kids in the classrooms, especially those kiddos with the most challenging behaviors. So that is kind of our look for this morning. So we're going to start again, just really briefly with a little background. Again, I think it's important that we all speak the same language, right? So that when I talk about trauma, you know what I mean. And when you talk about something, I know what you mean. So we know from decades of research, right, that exposure to trauma and toxic stress in childhood creates these long-term effects that we see well into adulthood, right, if not for the lifespan, if they're not addressed. And so we also know that trauma can disrupt neural development. And I will be honest with you all, I am a brain nerd, so I could talk to you about the impact on the brain forever, but we're just going to keep it short here. But we know that exposure to trauma and toxic stress from a young age physically alters the functions and the structures of the brain. So our children and teens that are in our classrooms who have trauma histories have brains that are wired differently from their peers. And so not only that, but we also know that children in the homes that are chaotic or stressful or violent, right, are also lacking those skills that they need for self-regulation because co-regulation was inconsistent or lacking altogether. And we're going to talk more about co-regulation in just a minute, but in this type of environment, our kids and our teenagers can kind of become stuck in the sense that they lack the skills to regulate their own feelings, emotions, and then essentially their behaviors. So we can think of it kind of like this. If we look at these triangles where we have typical development on the left, and you can see that these are color coded, right? So the corresponding brain region matches with its function. And so in a typical development, you can see that the biggest part of the triangle at the top is cognition. So in the absence of trauma, the brain develops so that the cortex, our thinking brain, plays the biggest part in our daily life. It's how we make sense of incoming information. It's what allows us to use all of our executive function skills so we can focus, we can manage our behavior, our impulses, we can organize information and learn, right? So we still have the parts of the brain, you can see them there, that are necessary for survival. We all still have a fight, flight, or freeze response. It's very important, but it takes a back seat to learning because typically we can grow up in a safe environment where we can explore and make mistakes without fear of death or significant harm. Excuse me. So this student from a typical development comes to our classroom with a brain that is primed and wired for learning. They are the little sponges that are going to soak up all of the information that we can provide. But on the other side, when our students experience trauma or that prolonged toxic stress, their brains develop and function differently. So we would need to keep in mind, right? Our experiences shape our brain development. So when kids experience chaos or instability or violence, the function of the cortex takes the back seat because survival is what's most important. So you can see here, right, in that triangle, the cortex is still there, right? We still have the ability to have cognition, but it's underdeveloped. The student comes into our classroom with a firm belief that the world is dangerous and their brain is wired for survival. And we will see behaviors that reflect that. So thinking about what that looks like in the classroom, right? Part of our responsibility as the safe adult in our students' lives is to recognize that some of these behaviors that we see may be trauma responses. They may be survival coping skills. And these are behaviors that are driven by a brain that is wired for survival and the belief that the world is dangerous. So what do they look like? Right? How does this manifest in our settings? So if we're thinking about fight, flight, or freeze, then we can think about these in those kind of three categories. So a fight response could look like a student who is angry or aggressive. This could also be that student who is very controlling, the one who has a seat at the computer table and that is their seat. And if anyone else sits there, then the morning is ruined. It could be that student who lies or blames others for their own behavior or for anything else. That student who pushes away friends and may reject your own attempts at connection, right, or developing a relationship. Also, that student who is very demanding and inflexible. So again, this is that kiddo who likes things a certain way, and when they don't happen, we just can't regroup from that. Excuse me. A flight response. So this could be literally that student who runs away, right? But it also could be those kiddos in our rooms who need to keep super busy. The ones who are always doing something. They're always moving. They're always engaged in something, even if it's not what we want them to be engaged with, right? These are the kiddos who may need to be the first out of the room. So they will push and shove to get into the front of the line. They may always be bumping into other people. It can look very hyperactive, right? Kids with a flight response could be always constantly on the move, right? Bumping into folks, always into something. We can also see a lot of baby or silly talk as a flight response. So if we have kiddos who are acting younger than their chronological age, that's something for us to pay attention to. A flight response is also that student who's hiding, right? We may be trying to avoid the task, and we may do that literally by crawling under a desk or a table and hiding. A freeze response can look like those students who appear bored. They may also be confused or forgetful. So I think of this as like the student who, when we went through the topic and the information 3 days ago, right, they knew it, they were on the ball, they could answer questions. But when I come back to it today, it's like they've never seen it. So those kiddos that can't really hold on to information the same way that their peers can. These are also the students who will talk to you about literally anything other than the topic at hand. And they may appear like they're not listening. They may seem like they're daydreaming. And if a student is in a freeze response, they are really hard to move through the task at hand. So I'm going to pause just for a second. I want to pull up the chat. It's hard for me to see it while I have the screens up, but I do want to ask, has anyone seen these behaviors? Have you experienced survival trauma responses in your setting? Yes, absolutely. Yep, for sure. Definitely. Every day, right? This morning, we may see all of these from the same kid. We might see all of these every day, all at once. And so I bring this up and I direct your attention to this because when I talk to folks in schools and I ask, have you seen survival behaviors? Have you seen survival coping skills? Do you know what a trauma response is? Sometimes they think, all that means are those big explosive behaviors when truly a lot of the behaviors that we see regularly from kiddos can be trauma responses and survival coping. So we need to think about that. Now, does that mean that these behaviors are only because of trauma? Absolutely not. But a really common misconception, again, is that these behaviors are choices. And so we know that because of how the brain develops in response to trauma, that these are not choices. So again, it's our responsibility as that safe adult when students are engaging in these types of behaviors to really think about the whole child. Think about their home environment, their experiences, and look for what else may be driving that behavior rather than just assuming that it's a choice. So I'm going to give a self-care alert here again, right? We are going to look at a case study. We're going to do that so that we can examine these trauma response behaviors a little closer. And so we're going to meet a fictional student named Caleb. Caleb has a lot of trauma in his history, and even though we're not going into graphic detail, there are things that may be upsetting. So again, please take care of yourself. So meet Caleb. This is our fictional student that we're going to work with. For our talk today, Caleb is a new student to the district. He is 6 years old. He's in the first grade. He currently lives with his aunt and his uncle, and he did not attend kindergarten. So I want to be very clear that Caleb is a fictional student, but his profile was built based on real students who did experience what Caleb did and who responded the way Caleb does in the classroom. So we're going to talk through Caleb's case study, and we're going to problem solve ways to support him and students like him in the classroom. We mentioned at the beginning that our breakout rooms are going to come sooner. So what we'll do is when we get into our breakout rooms, you'll have a chance to just kind of brainstorm with your group. What do you think is going on? How would you handle a situation like this if you found yourself with a student like Caleb in your setting? And then again, we'll talk through those strategies that we used that worked with the kids who inspired Caleb's profile. Hopefully, you will leave today with a lot more tools in your toolbox to help support your own students with trauma histories. This is our case study. If you want to link that in the chat, this is what folks will be kind of talking through in the breakout groups. I'm going to talk through it first, though, just in case you're not able to open it or download it so that we all have the same information. But what you'll have is a student report, and it starts out with a kind of brief social developmental history. So if you're in a school setting or you've worked with students, you've probably seen a report similar to this. So a little bit about Caleb. Multiple reports of domestic violence in the home, physical and sexual abuse, and neglect of Caleb since infancy. Caleb lived with his mother and never had contact with his biological father. Two of his mother's boyfriends were charged with sexual abuse of a minor pertaining to Caleb, once when he was 2 and again when he was 5. Both times, his mother pushed to have the charges dropped. Caleb's mother struggles with alcohol and drug use. Over the last 2 years, she's become addicted to opioids. And this has created a very unstable home environment, frequent moves, a lot of people in and out of the house. Caleb was also responsible for the care of his younger half-brother, who's 2 years younger than him and is 4 years old. Temporary custody of Caleb was awarded to his aunt after his mother overdosed in the car at a convenience store. Both boys were in the back seat at the time, and Caleb's brother was placed with a different family member. So that gives us a little insight into what Caleb has experienced and kind of what he may be bringing with him when he comes to school. Also, on that social developmental history, we have a report from his current first grade teacher. So what the teacher reports is that Caleb is constantly out of his seat. He yells no when he is approached and will crawl under tables, frequently wandering the room. He denies any responsibility for his actions, even if it's directly witnessed by someone else. He disrupts instruction as he will get up and then play, but his play typically reenacts television shows or movies that often are accompanied by bad language and adult themes. He also frequently escalates to physical aggression towards both students and staff, and will hit, kick, scratch, and bite. At times during escalation, Caleb has removed his clothing and urinated on the floor. So again, Caleb is a fictional student, but his profile is based on things that we experienced in the district, in the school, real students who have come from homes just like this and who have shown these similar or exact behaviors. And chances are you may have as well. Nothing, unfortunately, in Caleb's history was so outrageous that we'd never heard it before, right? We know our kids come from some very difficult places, and those behaviors show up in some very challenging ways. So when we get into our breakout rooms, these are 3 questions that your facilitators will pose to you. We're only going to do about 8 minutes in the room, so we're not going to have time for really in-depth discussion. What I want you to focus on more is kind of brainstorming. Whoever is willing to share, right? Just talk through the first things that come to your mind when you think of these questions. What traumatic experiences has he been exposed to? How does that impact his behavior? What behavior would you prioritize as the behavior to address first? If he's in your classroom or your setting, where do you start? And then what trauma-informed strategies would you try to implement? Again, we're brainstorming here because a lot of times kids like Caleb will show up. They enroll and they show up, and we don't have a lot of time to plan or think through how we're going to help. So we're really kind of thinking about what comes to your mind first. What would you do? What are your thoughts? We will come back together and share when our groups are finished. So I think if we're ready, then we will go into our breakout rooms about 8 minutes, and then we will come back and share. All right. Welcome back. Thank you for your patience. You know how it goes, right? Technology is our friend until it isn't. So sometimes things don't work the way that we want them to. But I would like to ask our facilitators to share one or two things that came out of your conversation. What was one major takeaway from your group or one aha moment that you would like to share? We'll try to avoid sharing things that maybe someone else has already shared so we can cover as many answers as possible. But if you were a facilitator in your group, what is something that came out of your conversation? Feel free to come off of mute or type it in the chat if your mic isn't working.
Hi, this is Dawn Burke. I'm the Trauma System of Care Administrator for Aetna and Sky. Thank you, Leah. As always, it's great to see you, and as always, you just do such a beautiful job with training. I would like to say, I think we all know what the traumatic experiences were. I think we're probably in agreement that aggressive behavior is pretty concerning for lots of reasons. And so we were thinking, one of the first strategies, of course, is to help him help him feel safe and nurtured and make sure that he's in the correct classroom environment to meet his needs. And I think there would need to be a lot of supports with this young man. And then I also recommend using Regulate, Relate, and Reason from the neurosequential model of therapeutics by Dr. Bruce Perry. So just really building a relationship with him, working very hard to do that, and eventually being able to teach him coping and regulation skills and also help his caregiver with that. So just a quick plug, here at Aetna Sky, we do have the core teen training, which applies to any age, child from toddlerhood to, really infancy or before up through adulthood, but it really talks a lot about the neurosequential model of therapeutics. So that was what we came up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. It sounds like you all had a good conversation.
I'll jump in here. This is Keith. Hi, Don. It's good to see you. So great conversation with the group. Got a lot of notes here. I'll stick with the just go quickly. The physical concerns really were top of the list in terms of the first question, second question. Again, prioritizing behavior, the physical behavior, the hitting, like Dawn said. The third thing, there were two things that jumped out a little different from what Dawn shared. One was the around reintegrative approaches to what Caleb experienced around shame. So not stigmatizing that shame, but a reintegrative approach, and particularly around positive engagement and being directive and clear in communication were two things that jumped out. Thank you. And thank you to the group for sharing. Appreciate that.
Excellent. I'm taking notes as you all speak, so thank you very much. I appreciate that.
This might piggyback a little bit on Keith. This is Laurie. In our group, we definitely, when we were trying to prioritize behaviors, we definitely started with that physical aggression of things that are so way up. But at the same time, we're talking about how getting in there right away to try to establish this much lower on the on the level of extreme behaviors to try to establish some sense of safety and sense of trust in the adults in the room.
This is Naomi, Group 4 representative. We had a great discussion and talked about a lot of the things that the other groups talked about. But one thing that is different is having the adults in the room to be observant of themselves. being that calming presence, making sure that they are self-regulating, and not being the escalator in the situation.
Perfect. And I see in the chat from Jennifer's group that the urination would be concerning due to the exposure. Absolutely. That's where that kind of they would prioritize setting some boundaries and de-escalating before there is an issue. Absolutely. Zones of mood to help with self-regulation and maybe a quiet zone in the room. Excellent. Thank you. Any other group that hasn't shared that would like to share?
Hi, I'm Lainey. I'm sorry I don't have camera access, so I don't have a picture, but I'm group 6. We talked about it's similar to what everyone else has been discussing about safety. Um, I brought up just the physical safety of himself in the room, and then we also talked about him feeling safe in his environment, and how focusing on that first would probably reduce a lot of the behaviors of concern, maybe not immediately, but over time. And one thing maybe a little different we talked about was just the importance of consistency and structure and routine for a kid like this, because not only does he not have a lot of experience with that outside of school, but he just doesn't have a lot of experience with school, period. So he's navigating school for the first time while also living in trauma, which is, it's hard to navigate school under the best circumstances. So that was something else we talked about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Right. He didn't have kindergarten. So this is his first experience in a classroom. Absolutely. Any other group? I don't know how many groups we had. I'm sorry. So I don't want to miss anybody. All right. I think someone's speaking. I'm sorry. I can't hear you. If you are. All right. I think that was all of our groups. So we will move on. Excellent. You guys nailed it, right? You hit a lot of kind of what we're going to talk through, which is great. I did see a question in the chat really quickly I want to address before we go any further. How do we differentiate executive dysfunction or neurodivergence from trauma-induced behaviors, right? What's a trauma response and what's ADHD? And the answer to that question really is that it's not our job to diagnose students, but we do need to ask questions. So what I always recommend folks is when you have behaviors that are cropping up, really think about what's going on. Think about, again, the whole child. What do they have at home? What does home look like? Even if a student is in a safe, supportive, loving foster family, there has been a disruption there. So there has been something happened, right, to cause that removal. So think about what is happening with that student. Ask those questions. What's going on? And I tell teachers and educators, if you're working with a student with ADHD like behaviors and you're using strategies that target ADHD and nothing is working, then maybe we need to think about those behaviors might not be ADHD, and maybe we think about some of the strategies that we're going to kind of walk through for the rest of this morning. So excellent conversations, excellent observations. You guys, like I said, you really hit it on the head. So these are what the kind of the categories that we focused on when we were helping Caleb in the classroom. And this is kind of the order that we worked through. And we're going to talk about some specific examples in each of these categories. You also have a ton of resources available. I think that those are available on the website. I will let my colleagues here kind of direct us to those, but a lot of resources for you to walk away with today in each of these categories. So as you're working with students on safety or discipline or co-regulation, there are things there that could help you. So we can't control what happens in our kiddos' lives outside of the classroom, right? And I hear a lot from teachers, well, he's just going to go back home to all of that, and what good can I do in 6 hours? And the truth is we can do a lot of good. And so we need to make sure that we are focused on providing those positive childhood experiences in the school setting. Remember, our experiences shape our brain. So we need to provide those experiences that are going to help our kids get back on that track. The great thing about these positive experiences is that they benefit not only our students with trauma histories, but all of our students in the classrooms. They help staff as well, and us too. So there's really no downside to really thinking about and making sure that you have positive experiences happening in your setting. So thinking about safety, a lot of you mentioned this, and this is where we started. It's really where we have to start. Safety is the foundation that learning is built on. And if we don't have safety, learning will not happen. So we have to think about then, what does it mean to be safe? And when we think about safety, right, physical safety usually comes to mind first. And so we know that there are things that, can prevent accidents, can help reduce or prevent injury or harm. But really, what we need to think about also is psychological safety, emotional safety, and that can be harder to define and harder to visualize. And I will say, just thinking about Caleb, we needed 3 adults in the classroom at all times for physical safety. Caleb was one of those students where we had no sharp objects in reach, and that's hard in a first grade classroom, right? No sharp pencils, no scissors, all of those things. So physical safety, right? We have to take that into account. But then we also have to think about emotional safety. And again, I will bring this back to the brain, right? Because we know Caleb's brain is wired differently. So what's happening in his brain is driving his behavior. So think about what our brains do for us in every situation, right? Our brain is constantly taking in information faster than we're aware of, thankfully, and scanning our environment for cues of safety and cues of danger. And so when we feel safe, when our brain recognizes those cues of safety, then we have better access, right, to that cortex. We have better access to those executive function skills that allow us higher order thinking, right? We can organize the information we're taking in. It helps us focus and sustain our attention. And pretty much school is built to really strengthen the pathways in our cortex. This is where we learn. This is where, we store all that information and build on it as we go through school. On the other hand, when our brain detects cues of danger, then our survival brain will take control, right? The cortex kind of takes a back seat. Remember, cognition, it's still there, but it's underdeveloped because survival is what's most important. And for a student like Caleb, everything comes down to survival and safety. So when we have a cue of danger, that alarm sounds from our amygdala, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. We've probably all experienced this. It is an important part of what keeps us alive. But for students like Caleb, that alarm may be sounding constantly. He may be in a state of constant alarm because there are so many cues of danger for that student. And so what we see in students like Caleb is that we have students who are struggling not just to read or write, but they've not been able to learn problem-solving skills, to adapt or cope with change because they are in a constant state of survival. So we need to create safety in our classrooms and in our settings so that they can access the parts of their brain that they really need for learning instead of focusing on survival. And that means that we have to really think about the difference between being safe and feeling safe, because those are not the same thing. So when our brain recognizes cues of danger, right, that amygdala sounds the alarm and our body responds automatically. Fight, flight, or freeze. It's not a choice, right? We respond so that we can survive. But the brain doesn't always get the cues right. If we go outside, right, and we see a snake, then the next time we go outside, we might be hypervigilant. We might be worried that we're going to see another snake. We might be looking for a snake. We might feel afraid that we're going to see another snake. And sometimes those strong feelings like worry or anxiety or fear, shame, are strong enough for the amygdala to sound the alarm. So all of these emotions can be interpreted as dangerous. So the brain doesn't always distinguish between real or threatened danger, and it can sound the alarm if there's truly a snake, right? An actual threat, or if a student is called upon to answer a question in front of the class, or if a student is singled out or punished. Fear is closely associated with shame. So, for our brain, sometimes being stressed, being afraid, can be interpreted as being in danger. A lot of us may have experienced this. There was a study a few years ago asking people what was scarier, the thought of public speaking or death. And 75% responded public speaking. So we need to keep this in mind, right? Because when we think about the students in our setting, we often think, but there's nothing dangerous here. And what we mean is the absence of trauma, right? But being physically safe does not mean that we feel safe. And so our brains will respond accordingly. So, how do we then define safety? How do we create safety? So, first we start with recognition, right, that it is not just an absence of danger, but a sense of calm. And one of you all mentioned that the adult needs to be regulated, right? The adult needs to be that consistent, calming presence to help create that safety. So we deliberately modified Caleb's classroom to create that environment that helped him feel calm. We lowered the lights. We put some of those pads over the fluorescent lighting so that it was dimmer. We played soothing music. We had calming scents, right? A little diffuser. So we altered the environment to make it feel more calm and relaxed. When we are in a situation that we don't know how to deal with or cope with, then our brain can tell us that we're in danger, right? Again, feeling vulnerable can be very scary for kids with trauma histories. So we want to prevent as much as we can those feelings of vulnerability. So we're thinking about safety in terms of, is this a situation within my ability to cope? We want our kids to stay curious, right? We want them to know that learning involves making mistakes, but that that's part of it and that it is safe to make mistakes. So this meant teaching Caleb ways to ask for help, ways to take a break that were appropriate so that he understood that situations were still within his ability to cope, right? Even if they were unfamiliar, he still had a way out. He had the ability to ask for help. And these situations are different for everyone, right? What feels safe for some people is scary for others, right? Some people make a living in public speaking. They love to do it. They choose it. And for others, that's just incomprehensible, right? So safety is different for everyone. So we need to recognize, right, that some of our kiddos will happily stand in front of the class and read a book report, and others will do anything they can to avoid that feeling. So making sure that we are tailoring the environment, tailoring the assignments, the way that students report on information they've learned, the way that students interact with the information and with their peers and teachers, that we are tailoring that to the students' needs. So also then thinking about, while we're focusing on safety, right, we're thinking about regulation. Because in terms of development, like we said earlier, regulation can get stuck. So a part of typical development is learning how to self-regulate. That means we have some control over what we're thinking and feeling. Those are skills that we're not born with. Those are skills that have to be taught. So if you think about an infant, how do they communicate when they have a need? They have one strategy, right? They cry. That's it. And so they have not developed any internal strategies to self-regulate. They must express the need for someone else in order to get that need met. When a baby cries, right, typically we hope that the caregiver soothes and comforts the infant, which regulates the baby's emotional state. And when that happens consistently, that builds up the cortex, right? That teaches the child that there are ways to deal with uncomfortable situations, that there are ways to cope. And as we have that kind of co-regulation, then self-regulation begins to develop. So co-regulation is adult behaviors that help regulate the child's emotional state. It builds tolerance of stress. We learn, right, that it doesn't last forever and that there are strategies that we can make it better. So those early experiences teach us how to self-regulate, and co-regulation is what builds those pathways in the cortex that help us self-regulate in the future. But think about Caleb. Think about other students like him. Do we think that he experienced consistent, nurturing co-regulation in early development? I mean, we know from his developmental history that he did not. So what opportunities were present for him to learn these skills? And for a lot of our students with trauma histories, they learn from infancy that their needs may not be met, or worse, that their cries are ignored or even met with violence. So these students come to us having experienced little to no co-regulation and therefore little to no ability to self-regulate. So that means that it's our job to teach self-regulation, to teach them these skills, no matter how old they are. We assume, right, that a lot of our older students should already have these skills. They should already know how to do this. They should just know better. But in truth, they don't. So this is what we mean when we say kids can get stuck. So I can have a first grader like Caleb who doesn't have any self-regulation skills. I can have a 15-year-old sophomore who also has no self-regulation skills. So it's our job to teach, to be that co-regulator, right? That adult who is helping to regulate the child's emotional state. So teaching these skills helps students calm their brains in response to those cues of danger, those trauma reminders. It's also what lets us then teach replacement behaviors and appropriate coping skills. And we're going to come back to that in just a minute. So thinking about teaching self-regulation, we do this by example, right, through co-regulation, but also explicit instruction. And I will say one of the resources that you all have is a full curriculum. It's called the School Intervention Project Curriculum. And it goes through multiple units and lessons on teaching explicitly safety skills, self-regulation skills, appropriate coping skills. It is written for middle and high school students, but there are examples within on how to adapt it for elementary students. It is a free resource. It's hard to find on the web, which is why I included it for you today, but it is fantastic. I strongly recommend that you take a look at it. So we need to teach these skills, and we can call it universal psychoeducation, but really what it comes down to is teaching our students and our staff what is happening, right? What's happening in the brain when we see these behaviors? What's the difference between typical stress and toxic stress? What is, causing the fight, flight, or freeze, right? It's so much easier to talk to a student about how they can calm down their brain, turn down their alarm, and regulate their feelings and emotions, rather than engaging in this conversation where their behavior is something they've done wrong and they shouldn't do it again, right? And we focus on punishment. So taking the stance that we're teaching our students, that we are using explicit instruction so that we can then teach how to regulate and how to avoid, right, these inappropriate behaviors in the future. So that brings us then to, what does discipline look like? What do we think about consequences, right, for a student like Caleb? So we have to make sure that we're really thinking about discipline from a trauma-informed perspective. We had to examine every single disciplinary response for Caleb. And there were these three elements that we addressed: safety, making sure that we were being proactive, and teaching. So discipline is necessary, right, to ensure that everyone is safe. So I have heard sometimes from folks who are not fans of trauma-informed practices that being trauma-informed just means that kids don't have consequences. It just means we make excuses and they have a green card to, get out of jail free. And that is not at all what trauma-informed practices suggest. What it means is that we have to make sure that as we are using disciplinary practices, that we are also making sure our students are psychologically safe. Caleb could not be in a small room with a male staff member. So the typical disciplinary response of sending him to the principal's office created an extremely dangerous situation. So we had to help him calm down, regulate before we could even start a conversation about consequences. So thinking about what it is your students need to feel safe and regulated before you engage in the disciplinary responses. Now, when discipline is effective, when it's done right, it is also proactive in that it helps prevent the behaviors from happening again. It's not just corrective. It should never just be about punishment, but really it's a supportive system that helps students understand why the action or behavior happened in the first place, right? Why it was inappropriate, and then teaching how they can do it differently in the future. We also have to give opportunities to practice, right? Teaching involves repetition. If you've ever taught students math facts or spelling, we have to teach it more than once. And the same thing applies when we are dealing with discipline. So we want to teach the appropriate ways of responding, the appropriate behaviors, and providing those opportunities for practice. Again, discipline is about teaching. So when you're looking at your disciplinary practices, make sure that there is a teaching component involved. These are some of the responses that are more trauma-informed. These we used frequently with Caleb. We created spaces where we could work on regulation before we started talking about inappropriate behavior or consequences. We made sure to separate Caleb's behavior from him. So we were a team, and we were working together with Caleb to address these problem behaviors. Caleb was not the problem. The behaviors were the problem, but we were on the same team working together to address that. So make sure that you're thinking about how to build that relationship again with your students. We want to be consistent, right? And we want to work together. So part of changing our disciplinary practices meant that we had to change how we collected data. I'm sure you've seen this, right? It's a point sheet. It's pretty typical, but when we were using this, what we found very quickly was that this system was not trauma-informed. So the way this usually works is the student goes through the day, someone circles how they did, right, in relation to their goals. But the questions became, how does this help Caleb? What does it really mean to follow directions? Does following directions look differently during morning work than it does during free time, right? If we have a sub, is it different for a different person? So using a point sheet like this was very inconsistent. And if a student can't anticipate or doesn't understand exactly when their behavior moves from appropriate to inappropriate, then we never establish consistency. And this point sheet nearly destroyed all of the trust that we were building with Caleb because he couldn't depend on us to be consistent. So thinking about your data collection, make sure that you are clear, that you are consistent. If a student is going to see a point sheet, then it needs to be a teaching tool. Make sure they understand what it means, how they're being evaluated, how they move from a smiley face to a frowny face, right? Make sure that it reinforces the appropriate behavior, not just punish the behavior that's inappropriate. And then make sure that we provide access to reinforcement. So we changed Caleb's point sheets. They looked more like this. So this is kind of an example where the student, Caleb did not like to see frowny faces. If there was a frowny face on the point sheet, we were done from the get-go. So this sheet only has smiley faces. And this was a teaching tool. So we have clearer understanding of what our objectives are. We have a better understanding of how Caleb's going to earn reinforcement. So you'll notice this is broken down into smaller chunks of time. Caleb was not a student who could go from morning till afternoon for reinforcement. We needed to break up his day, and he had multiple opportunities to earn that smiley face, right? He had 3 chances for each time break to stay on a smiley and earn that reward, because his behavior wasn't perfect. We weren't expecting perfection from the get-go, so he needed multiple chances to practice and try and to get there. So we tailored this to him so that he had all the opportunities to stay, and then we let him choose the reward. So thinking about your reinforcement, we had to change the way Caleb's reinforcement was structured. Typically, how we do this is that students have to meet a minimum requirement to earn the reward, right? If you meet 80%, then you get the reward. That doesn't work for students like Caleb. He just flat out refused to participate in this system. And you can think about it. It makes sense, right? Why would he try if he doesn't trust that we're going to give it to him? We're not consistent, right? We're not being predictable. Why would he buy in? Why would he even engage? He didn't. And a lot of our kids with trauma histories don't respond well to that typical token economy. So, if I went to work, or if you went to work for the month, and then your supervisor sat down with you and said, you did a really great job, but you only got to 80% of what we were looking for, so there's no paycheck right now. We'll come back and try again, maybe do better. We would not stay within that system, but that's a lot of times what we ask our students to do. So we set up rewards for Caleb that were frequent. If he had his point sheet at the end of 45 minutes, he had a reward, right? We reinforced every step of the way, making sure that it was frequent, it built momentum, right? It increased his buy-in. We meant it when we said he could earn a reward. He really could. Now, there is a time and a place for upping the ante, right? So that kids do have to work harder to earn that 80%, but it's not in the beginning. It's once they've practiced those skills, once they're able to demonstrate those skills, and we're working toward mastery. That's when we can set the bar a little bit higher. In the beginning, we want to reward every step of the way. I won't have a lot of time to go into this in detail for you all, but this is another handout that you have. Something that was very helpful for us was to do a really informal kind of behavior support plan. So we're not talking about the functional behavior assessment or anything that comes with evaluation. We're talking about looking at the behaviors in the classroom to help figure out what's driving them and how to respond. So one of the things that we looked for were, what were those predictors, right? What happened before we saw the behavior? And we could think about those in kind of 2 categories, fast or slow. So the fast predictors are those things that happen really close to the behavior. So this would be a change in environment, or a change in the type of attention, or who the person was that was working with the student, or an immediate task demand, right? But the slow predictors are the ones happening in the background. They're just as likely to increase the chances of the behavior, but they're not ones that we often see right off the bat. So this is maybe a student who comes to class hungry or thirsty. Maybe they didn't sleep well the night before. Maybe they're in charge of younger siblings, or there was no one at home to help with homework. Maybe they are in a prolonged situation with a difficult task. These slow predictors still influence the behavior. So we want to make sure that we're looking for those. Once we think about that, then we think about replacement behaviors. And what I want you to take away today about replacement behaviors is that the replacement behavior has to meet the same need as the inappropriate behavior, but it's not the goal. It's not the end result. So for us, for Caleb, screaming at adults and hiding under tables was our problem behavior. And so we had to think about, what does that mean for him? What does he get when he engages in that behavior? Well, it got us to back off, right? It got adults to step back and leave him alone. And that was really important for him to feel safe. So, what was our replacement behavior, right? It wasn't that he stopped screaming or stopped hiding, because those behaviors, those survival coping skills, are very important. Those are the behaviors that keep him marginally safer at home. So we're not trying to teach Caleb that he cannot do those things. We're just trying to teach him that it's not appropriate at school. So our replacement behavior for him was how he could signal for adults to back off without also disrupting the classroom. So we're not screaming, we're not crawling under the tables at school, right? At school, if an adult is too close, you raise your hands up and the adult backs off. That was our replacement behavior for Caleb. Hold your hands up. Now, to get this to be effective, right, we had to practice. We had to teach it to him, and we had to practice. And every single time he raised his hands, that adult had to back off. It didn't matter what the situation was. He needed to know that it would work. So replacement behaviors have to meet the same need, right? They have to serve the same function, and we have to provide an opportunity to practice. Telling him, if you hold your hands up, we'll give you a break, didn't mean anything. We needed to show him consistently that that's what we were going to do. So then thinking about your consequences, right? How are we reinforcing not just the behavior that we want to see, but also making sure that our behavior wasn't accidentally reinforcing those inappropriate behaviors. So if Caleb didn't use his hand signal and he screamed and the adult backed off, then we were reinforcing that screaming was the appropriate behavior. So really think about what you're doing in the classroom, how you're interacting with students. Make sure that we are not accidentally reinforcing those behaviors that we don't want to see. So to kind of bring us back to a place of hope, right? Because we talk about these things and it's hard in the classroom with students with behaviors like this. And it is really challenging, but there is hope. Neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to change and grow. And our cortex, the part of our brain that's responsible for executive function, right, for learning, for organization, it doesn't stop developing until we're in our 20s or early 30s. So it is never too late to help a student build new pathways, to help them rewire their brain to start thinking and acting in different ways. The more we practice those new behaviors, those new pathways get stronger, right? And then what was originally a new behavior becomes a habit. So really thinking about making sure that we are consciously helping our kiddos rewire their brains. And I will tell you, right, it doesn't happen overnight. Caleb had a difficult year in first grade. He had a difficult year in second grade, right? But those laid the foundation so that third grade was better and fourth grade was even better. And we continued to see that progress. So if you are the person interacting with that student right now and every day is a struggle, every day is difficult, please know that what you are doing is so important. You are the foundation for what happens next in that child's life. Research has shown us that the most consistent predictor of resilience is a safe bond with a single person, and that could be you. So never underestimate the importance of your presence in the life of a student like Caleb. Before we end, I would like to open it up for questions. If there are any questions or comments, I will stop talking. I also want to pull up the chat so that I can see if there was anything there. I saw non-stigmatizing discipline and the use of reintegration. Absolutely. Fear and shame are so closely connected that if we use discipline as a way to embarrass our students or teach them a lesson, right, make an example out of them, we are really, really not helping. We really need to make sure that discipline, the focus of discipline, is safety and teaching. Absolutely. Good, very good point. Any other questions or comments?
Leah, I have a follow-up question to that. Could you speak a little bit about, we talked a lot about Caleb and Caleb's plan. Uh, could you speak a little bit about examples of where uh, the adults, the educators, looked at the entire learning environment and how participatory use of other peers and students uh, could help kind of shape not only Caleb, but others who might be dealing with some of the stigmas associated with that behavior, just in general? Like, how much does the environment, the classroom itself, play a role?
It plays a huge role, right? So we took what we learned from Caleb, adapting his environment to the school. So there were changes that we had to make during hallway transitions. There were changes that we had to make in the cafeteria, how the class left and came back from recess, right? Those procedures changed. We did it because of what helped Caleb, but what we found was that it helped a lot of students, right? Behaviors were reduced across the board when we started using, strategies that focused on safety, regulation, and connection. I will say, I don't know if this completely addresses your question, but there was conversation at the end of first grade that Caleb really needed to stay with his teacher. Maybe she could do a 1-2 split, right? So that we could keep that consistency. But what we did instead was use everything that she was so good at to teach next year's teacher how to work with Caleb. So it really became at staff meetings, faculty meetings, PLC meetings, talking about the strategies, what was happening in the first grade classroom, what it could look like in second grade, and really kind of across the board. Working with Caleb shifted the way that we thought about problem behaviors in our school, and was really the driving force of why I started doing the work that I do. So it can make a huge difference to change that environment. I hope that got to your question.
Absolutely, you did. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. PBIS, right? Absolutely. If you are a PBIS school or in a PBIS district, you are already doing things that are trauma informed. A lot of PBIS really closely aligns with trauma informed practices. So I always tell folks, you may not need to reinvent the wheel, right? Look at PBIS and what it's doing, and use it with your students. I see somebody has their hand raised.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this information so far. I have a quick question about some other resources. I work with immigrant and refugee families, and we see a lot of these behaviors crop up with our kids when they first arrive. But the language barrier is such an issue with getting these strategies in the classroom. So I'm curious if you all have worked with families with a language barrier before, or if you have other like resources or research that we could read to help our schools do some of those practices.
That is an excellent question. We do have resources for regulation and teaching mindfulness that have been translated into Spanish. I don't know offhand that we have other languages than Spanish, and I know that's the most common one that we usually get requests for. But I can pull those together and email them to Naomi or someone, and then maybe we could, send those out to folks.
Yeah, that's great. Even just in English, we have a lot of Kinyarwanda and Swahili speakers in Louisville. as well as Dari and Pashto. Not like and some Spanish, but even just like having the starting point in English, and then we can have our interpretive services
Absolutely.
translate.
Yeah, absolutely. And look through some of the resources from this session too, and see if that might be a starting point for you as well. But I will pull some things together and send back.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Wonderful questions, you all. Naomi, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of close us out.
Thank you, Leah, for such a great, informative presentation today. She is a rock star, and remember that you will have her contact information when you get this PowerPoint presentation. So please feel free to reach out. So we just want to take a moment to say thank you for attending today. And also, please complete our post-training evaluation survey. Your feedback is important to us. And you will get resources along with this PowerPoint with an email and a recording of this webinar pretty shortly after we end. And the goal is to feel free to share this information with others who maybe didn't make it today. We also
Thank
want to thank our partners at Edna for sponsoring this event. We're so grateful for their support, which makes these learning opportunities possible. So again,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you to Leah. Thank you everyone for attending. The survey link is there. Please take a minute to complete those. If you are in Jefferson County Public Schools and you registered via our vector system, once I get notice of who attended, I will go in and mark those folks who need EILA credit. For those of you outside of Jefferson County that are within the state of Kentucky, and you want EILA credit, you will get that certificate within an email. But feel free to reach out. We're happy to make sure that you get that certificate to be able to turn in to your school district. So we appreciate everyone. Thank you for being here. Sorry, Leah, you're like, thank you, thank you, thank you. I
No,
kept hearing,
you're good. I wanted to mention, I meant to say it earlier before folks jumped off, but if this was helpful, if this information was helpful for you and you had other folks who maybe couldn't be here, we are offering through the Center on Trauma and Children 2 learning collaboratives that are starting in 2026. I think Sasa or Hannah, if you have the links for those. One is also sponsored by Aetna, and it is designed for anyone who works in a child serving agency, so social services, social work, DCBS, right? And then another one is geared specifically for school staff. So we have information on registering. Both of those are free. We cover a lot of this information in a lot more detail. So check those out if you're interested. And thank you all for being here. You've been a wonderful group. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.